think the room will just fill up and we will keep going. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Schmidt, and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library. We are delighted to welcome you to tonight's event, which focuses on the new book, Olga Lengyel, Auschwitz Survivor, as part of our new academic book series. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Olga Lengyel, Auschwitz Survivor, engages with one of the most intriguing but still under-researched aspects of Holocaust testimony, how the remembering and telling of an individual Holocaust survivor changes through time, through shifting contexts and with increasing age. The book focuses on Olga Lengyel, who was born in 1908 and died in 2001. As many of you know, she wrote a memoir about her imprisonment in Auschwitz, which was first published in French in 1946 and then translated into English in 1947. And half a century later, in 1998, she gave video testimony for the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. This book provides a condensed critical resource on Lengyel's testimonies, addressing matters of historical veracity, of trauma, of gender, of memory, and of genre in the transmission and reception of Holocaust testimonies over time and across cultures. Tonight, we're going to hear more from the authors about the interdisciplinary approaches of the book, as well as a response by Professor Sue Weiss, Professor of English at the University of Sheffield. And then this will be followed by a panel of short talks which discuss how testimonies are being made accessible today. I will be taking the place of Dr. Rachel Pistol, talking a little bit about the European Holocaust research infrastructure. And then I will hand over to my colleague, our head of collections at the library, Dr. Stephanie Rauch. And then finally, Dr. Bea Lefkowitz of the Association of Jewish Refugees will talk about the new AJR UK Testimonies portal. So just a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to the authors. You will be kept on mute throughout the entire program. If you have a question, please just post it in the Q&A. We will have hopefully some time for questions for everyone at the end of the formal remarks of the evening. So just to introduce the authors in the order that they're listed on the book, Sheila Jelen is Professor of Religion, Literature, and Visual Culture and the History of Judaism in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago in the United States. Peter Davies is Professor of Modern German Studies at the University of Edinburgh here in the UK. Hannah Holtschneider is Professor of Contemporary Jewish Cultural History at the University of Edinburgh, and Christoph Tonfeld is head of the research department at Dachau Concentration Camp Memorial Site in Germany. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the virtual floor over to Professor Sheila Jelen.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and I want to begin by saying thank you to all those who have made this book launch possible, to Christine and to Bea and to Stephanie, and also a thank you to Sue Weiss for agreeing to serve as a respondent. It's a pleasure and an honor for us to be here. As we get started, we wanted to talk to you a bit about what brought our group together to write the book we are launching tonight and what keeps us together as we continue to collaborate on another project that grew out of this one. Hannah Holtschneider and I met for the first time at a conference on the future of Holocaust testimonies in 2019. Subsequently, Hannah and another participant in that same conference formed a testimonies discussion group. Peter and Christoph and I jumped on board, and as we engaged in our general discussions about Holocaust testimonies, we were intrigued by our very different approaches to them, both because we were trained in different disciplines, with Hannah and Christoph coming out of historical studies and Peter and myself coming out of literary studies, but also because of our very different positionalities as Europeans and Americans, as men and women, as Jews and non-Jews. We decided that it would be productive to identify a testimony or a series of testimonies by the same person so that we could track our different approaches to the same material. Olga Lengyel's testimonies stood out to us because they are quite finite. There are only two that we know of, her memoir published first in French and then in English right after the war in 1946 and 1947, respectively, and as Christine mentioned, her audiovisual testimony given to the Shoah Foundation in 1998. The fact that these testimonies were given in two different media, text and video, and in very different moments, immediately after the war and 50 years later, presented us with some very interesting interpretive opportunities. We met over the course of 4 years to discuss these testimonies, and our conversations were never boring. We dealt with a host of questions, ranging from whether or not Lengyel was Jewish, to whether or not she served in the Auschwitz underground, to her relationship with unfolding Holocaust discourses over the course of the 50 years between her testimonies, and how these discourses, both popular and academic, may have impacted the shape of the testimonies as they exist today, alongside the questions they raise. So I'm going to now pass the mic to Hannah, who's going to give us a little bit of background on Olga Lengyel herself. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. So just to introduce Olga Lengyel a little, we've chosen to think about Olga Lengyel, about her testimonies, because her witness statements have not attained the status of the works by Elie Wiesel or Charlotte Delbo or Primo Levi, but she is still very well known to have gained a public profile as an educator and a philanthropist. Her testimonies have indeed attracted both a wide audience and some scholarly attention, including doubts that have been raised about her testimonies. These present persistent and challenging questions for us to address as scholars from different disciplines. Lengyel's published memoir is one of the very earliest post-war testimonies, coming out in French in 1946 and in English a year later. And much later, as we just heard, in 1998, she gave a video interview to the USC Shoah Foundation. Her work is internationally known and has been translated and received in a number of languages, and it also is said to have inspired William Styron's best-selling novel, Sophie's Choice. Her testimony as a Hungarian Jewish woman from Transylvania with medical training who survived Auschwitz as a medical orderly in the Jewish Women's Infirmary in Birkenau has played a key role in scholarship about the experiences of female victims of the Nazis and in controversies about truth, truthfulness, embellishment, and falsehood in testimony. So, who is she? Never having lived anywhere other than in Kolozsvár or Cluj, Lengyel was nevertheless at home in 3 different states before deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1944. She was born in 1908 in the Hungarian Kingdom of the Austro-Hungarian Monarchy. She resided in Romania from 1920 to 1940 and then again in Hungary until it was occupied by Nazi Germany from March 1944. Like many of her origin and social class, Lengyel grew up multilingual. She consistently presents herself as part of the Hungarian-speaking majority culture of Cluj. In her video interview in 1998, she refers to the city only by its Hungarian name of Kolozsvár. Her education included instruction in German, French, and English, recognizing German as the other dominant language of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and showing cultural affinity to her extended family in France, and she evidenced a cosmopolitan orientation by her family employing an English governess. Lengyel does not reference any competence in Romanian, even though, as a result of the post-World War I political reordering of Europe, Cluj belonged to Romania during a formative period of her youth. Lengyel also does not speak Yiddish, which was for centuries the lingua franca of East Central European Jewry, and she eschews any identification with religion, only reluctantly acknowledging her Jewish origins in her 1998 Shoah Foundation interview, and she is not mentioning this at all in her memoir. She also continually expresses admiration for German culture in both her memoir and in the interview. So there are some complexities here. Lengyel was the daughter of the industrialist Ferdinand Bernard, a director of coal mining in Transylvania, and of Ileana Legman, who was involved in charitable work. This places her firmly in the industrial and commercial bourgeoisie. She is well connected among her social peers, and she presents herself as at the heart of a number of institutions in the city, such as her husband's sanatorium and her mother's work at a local orphanage. While rural Transylvanian Jewry was among the least assimilated and most traditionally religious and often poor, Jews in the city of Kolozsvár were also part of an urban assimilated elite. Lengyel never describes her upbringing in terms of Jewish religious observance, culture, or language, or traditions. Indeed, she appears to have attended a Catholic girls' school. It is not clear how much Lengyel's family was involved with the religious Jewish communities, though her 1998 interview mentions her father's involvement as a donor and host in the community and that the family observed Jewish festivals. Lengyel's husband, Dr. Miklos Lengyel, was a surgeon and gynecologist with a clinic in Cluj. Although Olga Lengyel initially had studied for a degree in literature, Lengyel trained to be his surgical assistant, and they jointly ran the clinic. The couple also had 2 sons. Her memoir names them as Thomas and Arvad, while her 1998 Shoah Foundation testimony refers to one as Thomas Arvad and the other as David, who, also in 1998 testimony, Lengyel claims was adopted. Lengyel's testimonies in 1946-47 and 1998 include passages relating her deliberations about accompanying her husband on the transport in May 1944. Olga and Miklos survived the selection at Birkenau, but her parents and their sons were sent to the gas chamber straight away, along with the majority of the arrivals. Olga worked for a time in the Jewish Women's Infirmary in Birkenau, while Miklos was sent to Buna subcamp, where he worked as a medical orderly. She claims to have been able to visit him briefly in Buna before he died. Lengyel spent approximately 2 years in Paris from 1945 to 47 before she emigrated to the United States. In her Shoah Foundation interview, she reports that her cousin, Laszlo Legman, supported her initially, but that she then lived independently and wrote her memoir, which was first published in 1946 as Souvenirs de l'au-delà, Memoirs from the Beyond. How she supported herself is less clear, but we do know that on immigration to the United States, Lengyel took with her the family's art collection, which her father had deposited in Paris during the 1930s. Therefore, she may have had independent means, suggesting that we should not imagine her as impoverished in the way many survivors were. Lengyel's testimony is remembered for its forceful account of the work of Jewish women doctors in Birkenau and the devastating moral choices they had to make in choosing how to save pregnant women. She is also known, at least in its English version, for its description of the sadomasochistic. And with that,
Hannah, did you lose connection? Sorry, we didn't hear the last thing you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying I was handing over to Christoph, who will take on the part. I'm sorry.
So. It's okay. I thought so because it
sorry,
skipped
Christoph,
off the last thing.
Okay, thank you. And I continue by introducing briefly the approach, how we developed our view of Olga Lengyel's sources. When we started our project in 2022, initially it looked like a straightforward comparison between 2 distinct phases in the life of a Hungarian Jewish Holocaust survivor, documented by a written account published in 1946 and 1947, and an interview given in 1998. However, once our interdisciplinary exploration started, our 2 neatly arranged time capsules started to unravel. We did not leave our backgrounds in history, literature, and translation studies behind, but enhanced an empirical analytical perspective with a discursive analytical approach. We took in what Olga Lengyel said and when she did it, but chose to occupy ourselves more with why and how she did it and under what circumstances. Now, how did this process unfold? Written evidence we were faced with exposed numerous gaps and contradictions which could not be solved conclusively. That concerned the information provided in her biographical accounts, as much as several contexts that had to be gleaned from other sources. Therefore, it soon became clear that the true-false divide, as important as it is when dealing with testimonies or any other historical source for that matter, would not provide satisfactory orientation for what we intended to do. Lengyel's testimony was often found to have been used as common empirical evidence without realizing problematic implications, starting with that numerous scholars awarded her the title of a medical doctor while she actually was a trained surgical nurse. And Lengyel found herself in the middle of a struggle for the interpretive authority over life in the camps. By framing her published narrative experience of surviving Auschwitz in 1946-47 as an existential trial of her moral bearings and a hard-fought defense of her understanding of middle-class morality, she challenged an established view of Auschwitz as the death of individual agency and the end of morality as we know it. Much more than just the truth of an individual survivor's story, the truth of the iconic side of the Holocaust seemed to be at stake in her testimonies. We started out operating with Sue Weiss's distinction between embellished and false memories, only to find out that the accounts Olga Lengyel had left behind forced us to zoom in even deeper to get a clearer picture of the inner workings of her public presentations. She interwove individual as well as collective memories of her former fellow inmates and survivors. Her own voice intermingled with that of translators and publishers, and at times she spoke at a deeply personal level, while at other times she rather served audience expectations or made herself the spokesperson of her former fellow inmates. A final concern came into sharp relief when we became aware of criticism of parts of Lengyel's accounts, feeding into the distortions of Holocaust deniers, an issue that had been brought up most notably by Lawrence Langer. Especially her presentation of an abortion allegedly performed on notorious female Auschwitz guard Irma Grese contradicted in essential parts the description her fellow survivor, Gisela Perl, had published in 1948, a fact that was later picked up by deniers. Regardless of the importance of combating Holocaust denial, we rather took this issue as a point of departure to look into the gender-specific quality of the experience of the camps, to read Lengyel's and Perl's memoirs in dialogue with each other, and to question the ways in which Lengyel presented her alleged interactions with well-known perpetrators and what discursive function they played in her quest for moral realignment. While thinking and discussing along those lines, we arrived at a number of guiding questions. We chose to tackle these directly with our approach. In order to get a comprehensive idea of Lengyel's testimonies, we tried to assess more thoroughly what kind of status she was trying to claim as a giver of public testimony immediately after the war, and later when Holocaust survivor testimony had become widely acknowledged and appreciated as a collector's item for scholarly and educational projects in the 1980s and 90s. Thus, we were asking what we can learn about the changing roles and contexts of witnessing when listening to what Lengyel chose to say at different points in her life. Then again, although it took some time to establish testimony as a genre in its own right and assign it its place in processes of negotiating societal self-understanding, testimonies have always been part of public discourse. Their audience might have been bigger or smaller, more nation-specific or rather international, their impact marginal or more profound. So we came to ask what the significance is of the changing public discourses into which Lengyel's testimonies are published and read. What is more, we came to realize that despite her memoir already appearing at a very early point in time, she raises a number of issues in her account like pregnancy, abortion, and giving birth in Auschwitz, sexual activity among inmates, and so on. These topics have only found more widespread attention in scholarly research and society at large over the past 20 years or so. While there are certainly valid reasons for that, it also highlighted the fact that gender-specific ways of dealing with the experience and memories of Auschwitz are not only a persistent challenge for our understanding of the Holocaust, but that they are also framed specifically for publication purposes and are also publicly received in distinct ways. Therefore, the question arose, what role gender does play in the publication and context of Lengyel's testimony? And with that, I would hand over to Peter Davis to introduce the structure of the book.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Hang on, put my video up. Just to say that my connection has thrown me out of the Zoom room a couple of times over the last 5 minutes or so. So if I disappear again, apologies, but hopefully it will work now. It seems okay. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes at the end talking about what you might expect when you open this book, right? How is it structured? How does the structure of the book reflect our kind of collaboration? And it's a sort of the book in itself reflects what we did and how we worked. I mean, it reflects what happens when you get two historians and two literary scholars and you kind of lock them in a room for several hours and don't let them out until they come up with something, which is, you know, what we call interdisciplinary research nowadays. And I think the book is actually designed to demonstrate how fruitful and interesting and inspiring, but also very open-ended and quite interestingly tense that kind of collaboration can be. So what the book is divided into several chapters. There are a couple of chapters that we wrote ourselves, and then 4 individual chapters. Although we didn't write them entirely separately, we workshopped them and discussed them and made sure that they spoke to each other. But it starts with an introduction, which basically sets out Olga Lengyel's life in the way that Hannah talked about, but we also put her in the context of the various kind of public and scholarly discussions that have that her work has been important for over the decades. So we think about her in terms of not only her life in the camp, but also in terms of her contribution to thinking about the trials of perpetrators after liberation. How she may be thinking about this while she's writing her initial testimony and what this might mean. We then talk about how her work became important again, sort of in the 1980s for scholars of women's testimony, when feminist approaches were being applied to testimony for the first time. Lengyel's text suddenly becomes of interest to scholars here as a very unique kind of voice of a woman survivor. So that's the first chapter. It's quite a long introductory chapter that sets out those kinds of contexts, both historical context and biographical context, but also kind of context in the scholarship on Holocaust testimony. Then we have 4 individual chapters that sort of reflect our own sort of approaches and interests. I'm not going to summarize them in any great detail, but just to give you an idea, it opens with a chapter by myself, thinking about the published testimonies, the written testimonies, and the way the translations kind of refer to each other. So she initially published a testimony in French in 1946, sort of very early, and there's a testimony in English that comes out a year later when she'd moved to the United States. These testimonies are quite different. I mean, they're obviously the same text talking about the same experience, but they're framed in very different ways. So what does it mean when a testimony written by the same author in 2 different languages, in 2 different contexts, actually talks about the same experience in rather different ways? The English testimony is bigger, it's full of more information. There's much more focused on the kind of the crimes of the perpetrators and her discussion of them in terms of sadomasochism, as Hannah talked about before, whereas the French text talks much more about her as a resistor in the camp. So what does it mean when these texts are so different in the way they frame the kinds of experiences that the witness is talking about? The next chapter is by Sheila, and who's thinking about the kind of the different sorts of narrative that Lengyel presents in her testimonies, particularly in terms of gender. Thinking about the context to the understanding of questions of gender in terms of Holocaust testimony, but also how we can bring theories of gender and testimony to understanding this text. So it puts the text in dialogue with other testimonies by female survivors, how they perhaps have influenced each other, how there are similar stories told in slightly different ways in each of these testimonies. Hannah has talked about personal archives, private archives, and different kinds of ego documents, or different kinds of document that contribute to the history. And she's thinking about how a testimony is made in context, and to make a testimony in a particular context for particular people and for particular purposes. How is that different in 1946, 1947, and then again in the 1990s? What does it mean to write a testimony and then decades later to speak a testimony, to give a recorded interview? And she talks about questions of identity and how that's reflected in the different narratives, the progression of the different kinds of narratives, and the way Lengyel talks about her story. And the final chapter in this section is by Christoph. Christoph looks at questions of how survivors talk about perpetrators. He thinks about the questions of the trial evidence that people are giving at the time, particularly in 1946, the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. He also puts them in dialogue with other survivor test in a different way, thinking about how survivors like Lengyel and people with similar kinds of experiences as perhaps as medical orderlies in the camp thought about the perpetrators that they knew, that they on some occasions knew actually pretty well, who they worked with in the medical stations. How does this thinking and writing about perpetrators, what does this tell us about the kind of ethics of these testimonies and how the writers talk about this? So those are 4 separate chapters, and we finish with something that's a little bit more than a conclusion. It's a rather longer kind of epilogue in which we discuss open questions, things that we haven't quite been able to resolve. Because one thing that we haven't tried to do as a group is to try to synthesize our different approaches. What we've done is we've contrasted them with each other and tried to learn from each other, but without trying to come to a definite conclusion about things. So we think about some of the different theoretical contexts that Lengyel's work has been introduced to, and in particular, we think about some of the challenges to her testimony, particularly from the well-known Holocaust testimony scholar Lawrence Langer, who raised some doubts about aspects of her testimony, about their veracity and about the probability of certain things happening that she talks about. What we're trying to do here is not to prove it one way or the other, not to say, well, these things are true and these things are false, because that's not necessarily what we're interested in. We're interested in why a witness would write about things in particular ways. And what does it mean for us as readers of these testimonies, people through these experiences? What does it mean for us to make this kind of judgment about the veracity of the text, the truth and falsehood of it, the truthfulness of it? What kinds of questions are these? What kind of ethics are we really bringing to these texts? So there are some questions that we sort of finish with, deal with these kinds of challenges to testimony. And what do we mean by truth and truthfulness when we talk about testimony? What can we learn from them still now? A testimony that is actually, several decades old, going right back to the beginning of the first post-liberation testimonies. What can we still learn from them? Can we learn something new from them now, using these different methods? So what do these testimonies actually want? What are they trying to do in the world? What are they trying to affect? What kind of change is a writer trying to make when she produces a testimony like this? And is it different in 1946, in France, in 1947, in the United States, and in the 1990s, in a video testimony? So what's the difference between a written testimony and a video testimony? So the last question is, I suppose, how does the survivor's testimony change through time and throughout their life? How do they change the way they talk about things? And what does that mean? How do we understand it? Is it the most useful thing for us to do to look at how it changes through time and try to interpret that as for biographical context? Or is it more interesting to put them side by side and just compare them as individual specific testimonies that have their own aim and their own interest? There's a lot of different questions that we raise, and we don't really answer any of them. But that's the aim of the book, is to try and leave these questions open. And that's it. So I think, thank you very much for listening. And I think we hand over to Sue Weiss for her response.
Yes, thank you. Can you still see me, if that's what you want to do? I'm assuming you can. I'm really delighted to be here. And the first thing is to say I really highly recommend this book. It's extremely gripping to read. And to use a term that's already been raised, it feels open-ended to read, even though a lot of depth has gone into in the different approaches to this testimony. You'll feel when you read that there could be more and wish it were longer. So I'm going to now give my response, starting off by saying, as your book reminds us, Five Chimneys is important for a host of reasons, not least seen in relation to her video testimony from over 50 years later, and many of us will be more familiar with the text. Five Chimneys, as we've heard, is a really early survivor account of Auschwitz from 1946 originally. It focuses on the experiences of women, including those who were doctors or nurses in Birkenau, and represents the terrible dilemmas those prisoner doctors were faced with in relation particularly to pregnant women. This adds to the haunting imagery of Lengyel's maternal survivor guilt. And as is discussed in your book, her opening by using the phrase mea culpa, I blame myself, has become notorious as a cry of pain. She says, "It's in my heart," by which she means she seemed to make the wrong choice for her sons and parents, who then went to her deaths. And the writer William Styron's repurposing that moment for his novel and then the film, Sophie's Choice, highlights the actual absence of that idea of choice for Lengyel. That borrowing by Styron is a hint at the cultural influence of Lengyel's account and what's memorable about it, even though we might feel Styron latched on perhaps to the wrong things. In your readings in the book, the mea culpa, self-blame, doesn't stand for a terrible choice, as it does in Styron's novel, but rather for Lengyel's struggle to write about her experiences before survivor testimony became a recognised form. She integrates hybrid influences, religious and legal, Jewish and Catholic. It's also one of her efforts to establish a specifically narrative agency in the face of terrible vulnerability. And I felt that was a really useful thread of analysis all the way through your book. And this moment at the beginning of her text where she seems to blame herself for the deaths of her family is one element of a text that Peter calls a compendium, an experience in search of a form. Having said that, I'd just like to say there are many valuable aspects of your book to highlight, not least the impressive piecing together of the detail of Lengyel's biography from very scattered sources. But I've chosen to focus on just a few. In fact, there are 5. And the first is, as you've mentioned to some extent, your method of composition and collaborative working. As you say in the book, even where co-authorship and co-editorship takes place in academic or other kinds of work, it's not usually interdisciplinary, or even more strikingly, dialogic and interactive in the way we see here. Your method really makes sense for an area like Holocaust studies, which necessarily ranges from the arts to social sciences to forensic analysis, archaeology, and beyond, often in the case of individual scholars' interests. You've managed to replace a hierarchy by exchange with translation and literary studies placed alongside history. As you say, Lengyel herself had a literature degree, yet became a surgical nurse. So that's something for us all to think about. Secondly, you highlight the history of testimony as a form, and it's inspiring to return to an account like Lengyel's from a time before the notion of testimony or the social identity of the survivor, which we now recognise. Your study urges us to read accounts like hers in a new way, not just for the sake of events, whether public or personal, nor by treating Lengyel's memoir simply as a literary text, but rather, I feel, as a piece of active memory work. The early memoir is read in relation to the various editions and the video testimony from half a century later as part of a composite testimonial utterance over a lifetime. And this is important to show how a drastic disruption, like what Lengyel herself experienced during the Holocaust, can be incorporated into a life history, not recovered from, but not perhaps as bleakly ruinous as, for example, trauma theory or Lawrence Langer might suggest. And I've been inspired in saying that by the current work of Lisa Peschel. Lengyel's life appeared different to her, in other words, when she looked back in 1946, versus her perspective as a 90-year-old philanthropist and educator in the late 1990s. My third point or section is that I was struck by the rereading of striking episodes from the original work in your book, sometimes by several of you returning as individual contributors to the same episodes. The idea of Lengyel's public self-positioning seems crucial here, and it's allowed you to revisit her emphasis on the sexual economy of the camp, with what might seem prurience or even homophobia, to trace its roots not just in the discourses of the era of the mid-1940s, but also in her own psychological projections. Lengyel can maintain her own moral superiority and normalcy, to quote Rosanna Ramsden, by stigmatizing others. Or, as Christoph argues about the portrayal of perpetrators in the camp, she designs roles for them to play in reconstructing her own post-war moral universe. This is such an intimate testimony, in other words, it's as if we're looking sometimes into Lengyel's unconscious mind. It's fascinating to learn, as you point out, that Lengyel's prisoner number was consecutive with that of Gisela Perl, who you've also mentioned, another Hungarian Jewish prisoner whose testimony, called "I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz," was reissued in 2019, interestingly. This closeness is borne out textually in Lengyel's memoir. Sheila convincingly judges Lengyel to have borrowed the terrible accounts of infanticide from Perl in a way that doesn't disrupt the authenticity of Lengyel's account, but rather acknowledges a collective experience. In addition, painfully, it externalizes the death of her own children, so that the story of the loss of Lengyel's sons is retold through that of Perl's infanticides. My fourth response is about national contexts. Despite the current emphasis on transnational or even supranational Holocaust memory, which exceeds boundaries, it seems that specific local mythologies still remain very strong in framing it. As you show, this is enacted in Lengyel's case because her text appears in different national contexts, even though, as you also point out, it hasn't appeared as often as some. There's a demand for emphasis on resistance in the French version, to which is added for the English version the sensationalized emphasis on Irma Gräser and Mengele himself, whose physical beauty, as Lengyel argues, is at odds with their corruption, to use her word in the English version. It's fascinating to learn that episodes like these were published in men's magazines, amazingly for men only, almost as versions of pulp, with titles like Camp of Captive Women, which is really revealing about the readership for these early works and later ones. Even at the level of individual words, the emphasis on political resistance in French becomes instead one on social norms, bourgeois respectability and motherhood in English. The ecology changes again in the late 1990s in the USA with the redemptive pattern of the USC Shoah Foundation interviews, against which Lengyel seems to battle in another bid to assert her own authority about a situation where she really had very little authority. My fifth point is that I was impressed that you give an equally close attention to Lawrence Langer's essay, which casts doubt on some of the details of Lengyel's account. And you really convincingly mention what might be his possible reasons, including his dismay at Lengyel seeming reluctant, maybe for political reasons beyond her control, to identify herself explicitly as Jewish. Also, that her work conflicts with Langer's model of devastated and ruined memory in a way that overrides even his own expertise as a literary critic. I agree with your conclusion that it's a problem for Langer that Lengyel acts out her coping and remembering strategies rather than reflecting on them. She just enacts them, as Charlotte Delbo does. When I reread Langer's original essay, I found it quite challenging to read. He seems, as I think the word you use is irked, and he does seem in quite a trivial and sometimes unsympathetic way, quite negative about some really tiny details of her memoir. And it made me want to turn again to the opposite perspective. For example, Mark Roseman's analysis of Mariana Ellenbogen's psychological reasons to falsify the details of her experience in hiding in his book, which I think is just called In Hiding. For instance, Ellen Bogan said that her beloved aunt died on a death march when she really died in a camp hospital, in a way that conveys the extent of her loss. Falsifications or misrememberings like this can be even more valuable than accuracy, leading us to ask why Lengyel tells her story the way she does, rather than denouncing her errors or concealments. This is especially crucial in the distressing episode of an immediately post-war theft of Lengyel's watch, as Hannah convincingly analyses it in an episode I can't forget, to stand in for the unspeakable truth of a sexual assault. There are, as you all conclude, varieties of authenticity. Your careful analysis of Langer's motivation reminds us that our own projections are always at stake as scholars or readers when considering works of this kind. As Sheila puts it, this makes certain elements of testimonies jump out or even wound us. I'd like to conclude with a few questions, some of which you've alluded to already. What plans do you as a group have for future work of this kind? You mentioned some other examples in the book, including Elie Wiesel's Night, which have gone through different processes of translation, revision and reception. Might you turn to another testimony, perhaps another that is disputed in some way? The one that sprang to my mind is Miklos Nishli's memoir of his time as another prisoner functionary working alongside Mengele. Like Lengyel's, it seems to feature a missing Hungarian text, possibly a manuscript, and it's drawn very negative responses from later commentators, in this case, Bruno Bettelheim. Other questions. On the first page, you mentioned the possibility of the four of you having conflicting views, but this didn't seem evident. Rather, they come across as complementary reading practices. And I noticed you interestingly said you hadn't attempted to synthesize them, but they didn't seem exactly to conflict to me. So I wondered if there were disciplinary or other disagreements or differences of emphasis among you. Is the approach one that you could recommend other scholars also to use in turn? If so, what tips would you give? It sounds as if this collaborative project arose organically from chance meetings at conferences and other events, but could it be planned for in advance, which it sounds as if it might be now for you? And finally, which again might be something that you're going to move on to talking about, what is the role in Holocaust memory of medicine and its practitioners in the camp? You highlight, importantly, the strong presence of the medical profession in the SS. And in relation to fiction, we might think of works like Martin Amis's novel Time's Arrow, which is all about that topic. I wondered why you think so many of the early accounts are from the perspective of the other category, that of prisoner doctors or nurses, like Nishli's, but also Gisela Perl's and Lucy Adelsberger's alongside Lengyel's. Or does that question itself demand the kind of interwoven response that your book embodies? It's about who chanced to survive, the kinds of experience that are marketable or need justifying, the survivor's age at the time and experience. The list goes on. As you can see, so could my thoughts, but I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Sue. Do you want to take a moment to reply briefly to Sue's response, authors, before we get into today's access? Because it feels like a natural moment to do that. Anyone?
I think it's a good idea for us to respond to some of Sue's wonderful questions. Thank you, Sue, for that very thoughtful response to our book. And I just want to emphasize how supportive you've been of this project for so long. Very early on, we met with you to talk a little bit about these questions of veracity and different approaches to it, and your influence is all over this project. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I guess I just wanted to answer or address one of the questions, and then I'll open it up for some of the other from some of the other authors. You asked about future projects. So we are working on a project that grew out of this project on female prisoner physicians at Auschwitz. And we are currently trying to take the model of the Lengyel project and to complexify it even more, if that's possible, and to really think about some of the matters that were so beautifully articulated by my co-authors, in particular, different ecologies of testimony, different languages of testimony. One of the big issues that we're grappling with is the question of English, the English language, and why so many of these early testimonies were published first in English, even though English wasn't the native tongue of any of these survivors. What was going on there? And we're looking at physicians such as Ella Lingens-Reiner and Gisela Pearl and Lucy Adelsberger and Alina Brevda and others. So that is the direction we're taking it in. And going to your question about the planning in advance, this has been a really exciting project for me because it didn't just happen by chance. It was really something very intentional. A group of several scholars got together and said, we want to talk about Holocaust testimonies. And we carved out time, and we did it on Zoom, across countries and across space. And it really was an incredibly productive experience. And I think that Peter articulated it well when he said, what happens when you throw, scholars of different disciplines together in a room and close the door and say, produce something, you have an hour and a half to do it. It really did work out that way. So I'll stop talking, and if the other authors have anything they want to respond to in Sue's statement, please feel free to do that.
Yeah, can I echo the thanks, Sue? This is really fascinating to see our book through your eyes and the things that you draw out of it. Just very briefly to think about again the planning and the tips that we might have for doing something like this. I think one of the key things is that you have to actually want to do that. You have to want to work across disciplines. And you have to come across the kind of sticking points that when you say you don't see the different perspectives, they are kind of more complementary and they are woven in. But that's kind of after a few years of starting every meeting with, oh, don't we agree? Don't we all agree on this? And then finding, oh, no, we don't. And we come from such different perspectives, or we have very different questions of what we want from testimony. So the idea that we look for historical verification, or that we look into the gaps of what survivors have been saying and how this can be interpreted. And so the tip I would give is you have to establish that you want to collaborate this way, and that you want to critically interrogate your own disciplinary perspective. And you would like somebody else to contribute to the thoughts that you are thinking in a way that furthers them. So you have to kind of take the combat out of academic work and think of it as complementary. And that can be really productive. And then you have to find out whether you can write together, which is another journey that we have been on, and that I think that we will continue to explore how you can actually co-author texts. How does that work? And what are the different stakes in somebody else editing your prose and you editing somebody else's prose and you mixing it all up in order to come up with the introduction. So I can say that we started out writing the introduction by each taking a different section. and kind of saying, okay, that's my expertise. I'm just going to throw it at this section and we're going to see what comes out. And then we mixed it up and we shifted things around and we edited each other's words. And I think you have to be willing to do that. And you have to be willing to have your texts taken like this. And I stop there. And probably Peter and Christoph will want to say something too.
Yeah, I would just briefly would like to pick up on the remarks you made, Sue, concerning the role of medicine in Auschwitz and the role that the prisoner functionaries with medical background had, and as you also raised Miklos Niesli as an example. I think as we choose especially a gendered approach to analyze the sources that we work with, and we look into the accounts that female prisoner physicians have left behind, I think it's also worthwhile to keep in the back of our minds how male prisoner physicians wrote about their experience. And Niesli, of course, is one of them. Otto Wolken comes to mind, or Mauritius Berner. So, of course, there are a number of examples that we could also bring into the equation to have, especially to get an idea of what might be differences in gendered approach to memories and presentation. And of course, we look at an extremely privileged group in terms of the role they played in the camps, and also the point of view that they had later on when they wrote their accounts, published their accounts. So it's a very specific group we're looking at, who had to work at sites where different nationalities, patients from different nationalities came together. They interacted with the SS very closely. They had to make decisions about life and death under very adverse circumstances. So it's a very, I think, rich material on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a very special group of people who left their accounts behind. I think I leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to add a couple of things. Firstly, I missed, unfortunately, some of what you were saying, Sue, because I was my connection failed. So I hope I'm not repeating anything that anyone has said. You asked about conflicting views and differences of emphasis in your statement, and that's a really interesting one, because I think we're all sympathetic to this project. So it's not as if we're having stand-up rows and storming out of the room and saying, I can't work with these people anymore. There was always a sense of a kind of a common enterprise there. But we did have different emphases on quite a lot of things. And I was trying to think, what would be a good example? And I think it comes down to a kind of ethical questions of really. The question of, well, why does it matter if a testimony is telling us things that we would perhaps doubt? Why does it matter if there are testimonies that are related to each other that seem to be telling the same story and have perhaps borrowed a story from each other? And I think from a particular kind of historian's perspective, that matters a lot, because there is truth and there is not truth, and there are facts and there are not facts. And these things, of course, matter to all of us. Truth and truthfulness is really, really important, particularly with a text like this. Not only with Holocaust testimony, but with Holocaust testimony, it's specifically really, really significant. But the question, I think, for each of us was why it matters and how it matters. So for me, I can't talk for everybody, but for me, it matters to do with how we trust the text and what we bring to it, how we are able to, to understand what the witness is trying to do with this text. And it's also, for me, I think, less a question of, is it all factually correct? But how are these incidents worked into a narrative that tells us something about what this witness is trying to do and what this witness is trying to say? For me, I think, as someone who's interested in narrative and translation and different contexts, it's less important to try and establish what actually happened than it is to try and establish why is it being written this way? What's the rhetoric of the text? How is the text trying to affect the world? And those for me are ethical questions as well, but they're different ethical questions from the ones that are perhaps to do with, is this true or not, in a very strict sense? So these were the things that we talked about quite a lot. And I think we all kind of came sort of closer to each other in our thinking about these questions. And I think in terms of other things we were thinking about, well, what's the status of a text actually? Is there such a thing as the original testimony, which everything else is kind of a version of? You know, that translations are a translation of an original testimony and therefore of less interest than the original one. Is an earlier testimony actually the original testimony? Is that the most important one? Now, we know that people like Elie Wiesel have always said that, you know, for Elie Wiesel, Night is his big statement. And for him, everything sort of is a commentary on that down the years. But I don't think that can be the case for people who are writing in the kind of situation that Lengyel's writing in. She's writing a fragmentary text. She's writing a text in a particular context. Her text is made up of different textual elements coming from different languages, some of which we have and some of which we don't. And so the question for me is whether a translation is simply a new statement in a slightly different context, rather than one that takes us away from the original. So I'm interested in testimonies as being not original text, but as interventions in a specific context. And I think of them as being not in one language, where we can say this is in French and this is in English, but always to an extent as being translingual. There's always an element of multilinguality going on in them. There's always a negotiation of different languages and identities happening in these texts. What happens when you try and translate that into a different context is really interesting as far as I'm concerned. So those were the kind of things that we talked about. I'm sure there were others that we could come up with, but they weren't conflicts as such, but they were just sort of productive tensions and productive sort of frictions between us that I think took us further than we would have been able to go by ourselves.
Can I respond to the response?
Sure.
Just to say that it's been really an honour to have this glimpse into what seems like a utopian working practice and the text that you've generated, which again, I highly recommend. And actually, Christoph, something you said a minute ago about the importance of medical practitioners in the camps being that they were a privileged group. Suddenly I feel that is an example of your practice, because I'd always thought of it as being about what readers want to read about. They want to read about the horror of medicine being turned to be deathly, the reverse of the Hippocratic Oath. But actually, you're talking in a slightly different way about the practicalities of who was there to tell their story, even. So as everybody listening can tell, there's, from your responses to what I said, it's just extremely multifaceted.
Thank you, everybody. Just to remind everyone in the audience, you can put any questions in the Q&A feature, and hopefully after the next sort of short round of presentations, we have some time to answer questions from the audience. So I am taking the place now, switching my hat, to talk a little bit about, start to kick off our discussion of how testimonies, Holocaust testimonies, are accessible today. And so I'm going to talk about one facet of this, and then I'll hand over to my colleague. And of course, there's many Holocaust testimony projects, which Steph will talk a little bit about in a second. But I'm specifically talking about the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, which is a project that was originally funded since 2010 by the European Union to advance transnational Holocaust research, remembrance, and education, primarily through making collections more accessible and working against the dispersion of Holocaust-related collections and expertise. And we're talking about all of this interdisciplinary cooperation. This is the same spirit in which IRI was brought together. It, of course, brings together some of the most important collection holding institutions and research institutions, as well as specialists in the digital humanities. And in January of this year, it went from being a project to a permanent organization. It's all alphabet soup, but I'll just say it: European Research Infrastructure Consortium, also known as an ERIC. So it's moving from becoming an IRI to an ERIC. The kind of key way of overcoming dispersion, and this is obviously not only related to Holocaust testimonies, but also Holocaust related archives and documentation, has been the creation of what is called the IRI portal. which is a gateway for finding metadata of dispersed collections, including metadata related to Holocaust testimonies, but of course not everything. It really is and should be the first place anyone consults for research on the Holocaust, because you get a good sense of where materials are held and how to access them. And as I mentioned, also, it's not only a network of archives and not only a network of collections and metadata, but also a project that seeks to bring together experts. So it's a people network too. We provide training opportunities and disseminate new research. And IRI has produced over the years a number of resources and toolkits, including online courses, transnational fellowships, blogs, and podcasts. And this is just a few indications of the kinds of engagement with the different types of sources that IRI has produced. And of particular interest for audiences tonight is one of these particular early online editions. This is a collection of primary source material that's been culled from different archives, and it includes annotated digitized documents from different holding institutions collated around a theme, for example, diplomatic reports. And for our purposes, the online edition of early Holocaust testimony may be of interest because it brings together, I think for the first time, different samples of early testimonies of Jewish witnesses and survivors taken before the 1960s. So I'm not sure if that's actually showing. Oh, so this is one of these animated ones. As it moves into a permanent institution as an IRI ERIC, each country has developed its own national node to continue the work of the central organization, including developing the portal and ingesting new metadata into the portal and mapping other collections. So the UK version of the national node is led by Dr. Rachel Pistol, who unfortunately couldn't join us tonight, and she's based at the University of Southampton in partnership with the library, with the National Archives and Royal Holloway. And we will pick up a lot of this work here that I've just outlined on this slide, providing training opportunities to university students as well as national fellowships. And we will continue the mapping of Holocaust collections across the UK to make sure, and of course the Crown dependencies, to make sure that they are represented in the IRI portal and develop new projects and research tools. That is a really fast presentation of IRI, probably the fastest ever been done before. So if you have any questions about IRI, please feel free to, like I said, post those in the chat, or feel free to be in touch with me after this, because I know that was a quick one. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Rauch, who is the head of collections at the Wiener Holocaust Library. Steph?
Thanks, Christine. I will tell you a little bit about the Wiener Library's collections where they relate to testimonies. We hold quite a wide variety of testimonies, which come in different formats, were created in many different ways, periods, and contexts, and really reflecting changing approaches over the last 8 decades. Among our most significant collections of testimonies are 350 reports that attest to Kristallnacht, which were collected shortly afterwards by the Jewish Central Information Office, which is the Wiener Library's predecessor organization. Now, these testimonies were probably gathered through face-to-face interviews, telephone conversations, letters, and written reports, also by selecting and cropping newspaper articles and obtaining informal intelligence via conversations and correspondence with other organizations and contacts. Another pioneering early project is the Eyewitness Accounts Project that Christine knows most about. This project was initiated by Eva Reichmann in the 1950s and funded by the Claims Conference, and which saw the creation of some 1,300 accounts, which covered a much wider range of experiences compared with the Kristallnacht project. We do know that advertisements were placed in the British and later wider European press for eyewitnesses to come forward. And then trained interviewers working for the Wiener Library were dispatched, and a transcribed interview was shown to the interviewee to ensure that the content was accurate in terms of what they'd said. And in some cases, eyewitnesses also submitted their own written accounts. And then subsequently, the testimonies were analyzed, catalogued, and indexed. Both of these collections are accessible online with translations on 2 standalone sites that we created, as well as our brand new online archive, Wiener Digital Collections, which you can find under whlcollections.org. In addition, we also hold nearly 500 unpublished memoirs alongside over 1,200 other autobiographical accounts, including published books. We could add obviously things like affidavits, other court statements, statements in restitution claims, depending on your definition of testimonies. In our reading room in central London, we offer access to a suite of audio and audiovisual testimonies as well, some of which are unique to us. That includes a collection called The Girls, which is 15 interviews recorded in 2010 with female camp survivors who were allowed into Britain after 1945 on temporary visas. Or there's the Conan interviews, which is a set of conversations which were recorded in the late 1980s with 64 former Jewish inhabitants of Conan in Poland. We also provide access to third-party databases of video testimonies, notably USC Shoah, the Foundation's Visual History Archive, the AJR's Refugee Voices, and also Yale Fortunoff Archive. And we are the UK's access point for different type of accounts. Luke Holland's Final Account Third Reich Testimonies collection, which is video accounts from the side of the perpetrators. And at the moment, we're working with Helen Roche on making her interviews with former Nazi elite school pupils accessible online as well. And finally, there are many more as of yet uncatalogued interview recordings in our backlog, many of which come on obsolete data carriers such as pneumatic camcorder, cassette, or VHS tapes, and which require digitization before we can even access them. Fortunately, we have raised funding to be able to digitize and catalog many of these recordings, and which we'll be adding to our collections over the next couple of years, though they may not necessarily go online for remote access from home. We continue to receive more and more offers of such materials, often from researchers looking for a home for recordings they might have created as part of academic work 2 or 3 decades ago. But compared with written testimonies, these audiovisual materials are a lot more challenging in terms of the legal and ethical situation. So at the moment, we're still taking this on a case-by-case basis, but there will be more added to our online and reading room access over the next few years. Now hand over to Bia Lefkowitz, who will be talking about the great new UK testimonies portal.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, thank you for inviting me tonight. Before talking about the portal, I just want to congratulate the authors on the publication of your new book. I think the book exemplifies an innovative and deep way of engaging with longitudinal witnessing of Holocaust survivors. And while Nora Schenker talks about the importance of testimony literacy when working with testimonies and stresses the importance of macro and micro factors shaping the production of testimonies, such as institutional project protocols, relationship between interviewer and interviewee, and societal remembrance practices, I think the focus in Olga Lengyel, Auschwitz Survivor, focuses much more on Olga herself and her changing sense of identity and agency. And I think this person-centered approach to testimony is very inspiring and can help us to understand how experiences are narrated and interpreted by the researchers. In fact, after reading the book, I need to go back to one of my early testimony interviews with a Salonican Auschwitz survivor who worked in the registry office and whose tone of agency is very similar to Olga's. When she described her experiences to me in the early 90s, it seemed that she was able to tell the SS men what to do and that they even listened to her. At the time of the recording, I was uncomfortable with this, as that kind of narrative did not fit in with the other testimonies. But I'm not here today to talk about the book, but to tell you about the newly created resource called the Holocaust Testimony UK portal. And if I may just check some slides. So hopefully this portal will enable more studies on longitudinal witnessing. We launched the Holocaust Testimony UK portal, a project by the Association of Jewish Refugees and the UK government last year. And one of the main motivations to create the site was to be able to trace the various interviews of one person in one digital space. It seemed the right time for the institutions who've collected Holocaust testimonies over the years to come together and make full testimonies accessible online. While this portal focuses on testimonies recorded in the UK or testimonies which have a connection to the UK, I hope that the portal will inspire other countries to follow suit. The 3 core principles which guided us, and I'll just do it very quickly, were an important core principle to the portal was that each large or small partner institutions, and here you can see some of our partners, can decide how much access they will give to the interview. So you can either just give the metadata, or you can facilitate full online access. So our own archive, Refugee Voices, which is also accessible at the Wiener, has made 100 interviews fully accessible online, but the rest you need to register or go to the Wiener Library. Another core principle was that the portal should be survivor person-centered. And here you can see when you do a search, the names of people come up. Because the idea was that we pay tribute to the women and men who've entrusted their testimonies to the various archives and projects. And then you can go further. Let's say Peter Summerfield here. It shows us he was interviewed by 2 projects, one in 2016, Refugee Voices in 22. And when you then continue, you go to a profile site. So every interview has their own profile, and you can see the 2 interviews, the full interviews here on his site. The third principle was to create a user-friendly database-driven site, which allows users to search testimony, and you can see here by experience, birthplace, age, date of recording, name of interviewer, and of course also by institution. Currently, the portal contains the metadata of 3,295 interviews, and 2,581 of these are fully accessible online. These recordings, which are not edited and will contain silences, sighs, interruptions, and I'm sure other surprises, as I said, are available here without the need for registration. Recordings with the same person over a time span of many years, and recordings with the same person in a similar time frame by different projects, audio and video, are available here. And sometimes, maybe the majority of times, of course, the recording of just one interview with one survivor. And just wanted to show you here 2 examples of people who've given multiple testimony. Here is B. Green, who came on a kinder transport from Munich, and you can see it lists the institutions and the times when the testimony was given. And then you can go to her site. 2 interviews are completely accessible here. And here you can see it's a time span of 10 years, 1996, Shoah Foundation, in 2006, AJR Refugee Voices. And you go further, and this gives you then access to the audio interview at the Imperial War Museum. It links it to the Wiener Library, and you can then, have 4 interviews basically available here. Another example of a very prolific Holocaust testimony giver is Leon Greenman, a British Auschwitz survivor. And again, it shows you where he was interviewed. Interestingly enough, it's also an early testimony in the Jewish Museum, which was, I think, actually recorded in France, and then later interviews as well. And here, this is his, he gives messages in both the UCS Shoah Foundation interview and in the Refugee Voices interview, and just comparing them, the messages are quite different. In the 1995 Shoah Foundation interview, he talks about the importance of remembrance and social action. In 2004, he stresses the importance of speaking for the survivor and how important it is to speak and witness for the survivor. And even before he talks about the message, he also talks about the photographs of his wife and baby who were killed in Auschwitz in his living room, and the fact that he still talks to them, to the picture, something which he didn't mention in the Shoah Foundation interview. So please go to the website, engage with some of the, with some of the 2,500 online interviews, and get in touch with me if you need any other information. I hope that the portal will inspire more studies like the book presented this evening, which will explore memory and testimony giving over time and present us with new questions related to the understanding and interpretations of the many recorded Holocaust testimonies from the end of World War II until today. Thank you so much. Here's my email. And I shall stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Bea. It's always good to look at this project, and definitely recommend having a look at the website because it's fantastic. So yes, I'm just looking to see if there's been any questions. I don't actually see any yet from the audience, so I don't know if anybody else from the panel would like to say anything else while people might be gathering their thoughts in response to the short presentations or any other thoughts. Perhaps
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, a question to the panel. What I thought was interesting that you obviously compare a text, a manuscript, a book to the recorded testimony. And that's something for me which is quite interesting because I'm working at the moment of my on my mother's manuscript, and she has a manuscript written in the 90s, and then also 2 interviews in 2 different languages, Shaw Foundation, Refugee Voices. And I wonder how, what you think about this idea of comparison, published book with testimony and the comparisons of just recorded testimonies themselves.
Thank you. That is such a fascinating question. And that is something we've been thinking about as well. And I think in our context, we were thinking about the length of time that is passing between people giving testimony. And so that testimony giving is not something that people do once and then never again. Although, of course, there are some people who do it only once, and we are privileged to have that. But for those who are speaking more than once, what has been fascinating to me, and I think to my co-authors as well, is to think about what is changing between those different instances of giving testimony. Who are they for? Who are they addressing? And why is the survivor speaking? And then to think about the different emphases that people may give. So in terms of Olga Lengyel, she is spending a really long time speaking about her childhood in the Shoah Foundation testimony. The interviewer doesn't really want her to do that. She's trying to hurry her along to get to what the Shoah Foundation interview is supposed to be about, namely the experience of persecution and of imprisonment in Auschwitz. But for what is important to Olga Lengyel is her childhood at that point. And that is such a contrast to what she was doing in the testimony she wrote in 1946 and then published several times, where the emphasis is simply mostly on the kind of persecution period of deportation and then being imprisoned in Auschwitz. And so observing that and thinking what is changing for people as their relationship to their own history is changing. So the longitudinal aspect, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And when we have that opportunity, it is really wonderful to be able to ask those questions and to observe them.
I wanted to also respond
Yeah,
to
and
that.
I think
Peter, you want to go ahead?
no, go on. Okay, hang on a moment. Let me put this on. Yeah, I was just thinking of the question of what is revealed and what is concealed in each kind of testimony. With a video testimony, you have the voice of the questioner, you have this very obvious framing, and there are particular routines that the questioner is going through depending on what context they're giving the testimony in. And the things that the moments of collaboration and the moments of conflict are often very clear. In Lengyel's testimony in the 1990s, there's clear moments of tension, more than the one that Anna has just mentioned. Is kind of all the way through. There are moments where she just does not want to answer a specific question, and there is this kind of really tense silence between them. And these things progress through a video testimony, and you can kind of see the relationship developing or falling apart and coming back together again. And these things are really important and fascinating. These things happen again, I think, with a written testimony, but you just don't see it, right? You have this thing in your hand, which is an object. It may have been published, it may not have been published, but it's often very tempting to look at a text, whether it's published or not, and think, well, that's just a stable thing, that's how it is. But actually, below the surface, there are always collaborators. There are discussions that the person has been having with people. There are translation issues going on. There's language advice. There's editorial interventions happening in them, and that kind of thing is concealed. So I find it interesting in terms of the comparison to see what we might learn from seeing these kinds of moments of conflict and collaboration in a video testimony, and how we might think about what's going on sort of beneath the surface of something that is a published or written testimony that gives the illusion of stability, if you see what I mean.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on your question a little bit. I recently published a book called Testimonial Montage, where I look at Holocaust testimonies given by four survivors from the Krakow ghetto resistance who testified in Israel in various genres and in various formats. And there was one woman in particular, her name is Hella Rufeisen Schipper, or Schipper Rufeisen, who gave a lot of oral testimonies and also wrote a book. And one of the interesting things that I found in reading all of these and watching all of these and listening to all of these at the same time was how very much she struggled to resist a kind of overarching collective narrative that she was expected to tell within her Israeli context and within the context of the resistance that she fought in. And you know, she was a courier. She was one of the couriers, and she brought the first weapons to the Krakow ghetto resistance from Warsaw. And in her written testimony, her published testimony in Hebrew, she describes the response to her bringing these weapons, and that particular testimony was co-authored with someone uh, at the ghetto museum. The word I'm sorry, I'm so tired. I'm a little bit jet lagged. I just got here this morning.
לוחמי הגטאות.
Thank you, Lochamei HaGetaot. Thank you. And um, she basically tells the story of her great heroism, etc. But then in her oral testimonies, she uses this tone of voice, which is like, really, you know, really, did these weapons really matter? Did it really matter if we killed people with them? That wasn't the point, you know. So there's this kind of scriptedness to the written testimony that was really different from what I heard in the oral testimonies, and I found it very rich and productive to work with them at the same time.
Just want to draw before we close. There's been 2 posts in the Q&A, so I'll just bring those to your attention now together so that you have a moment to respond. There is a note from Eliza who's asking, what lessons are there for interviewers taking testimony from survivors from your fascinating work? And then there's also a really interesting comment from Deborah, who thanks you for the excellent scholarship and attention to Olga Lengyel. Her organization, created to honor Olga Lengyel's legacy, provides teachers in the US and Europe with a pedagogy that combines inquiry-based learning with reflective writing and identity to help teachers make Holocaust education relevant for today's students. And she's looking forward to your book and potentially using it as a tool for teachers to address some of the questions you raise. And this is from the Olga Lengyel Institute, TOLI.us, for anyone who is interested. I'm just going to push these in so that everybody can, I think, see them. Would anybody like to make some final comments from the authors?
I just wanted to respond to Deborah's comment briefly. Deborah, before I came to the University of Chicago this past year, I was at the University of Kentucky, and I participated in a really interesting project teaching Kentucky public school, middle school and high school teachers how to teach about the Holocaust because it was mandated by the state. And one of the leaders of that initiative, her name is Lauren Hill, who's a public school, who just retired, but she was a middle school public school teacher in Kentucky. She was a part of one of the Tali workshops over the summer, and she was really very, very engaged in what your institution had to offer, and was really eager and excited about this book. So thank you for creating that opportunity for teachers. Really, really meaningful stuff.
I would like to pick up on the aspect, as we just now heard from the Olga Lengyel Institute, how they would like to use it as a resource. Of course, the institute as such that it exists today, of course, in a way also informs us about the biographical trajectory that Olga Lengyel took. That in 1946, 1947, when she published her memoirs, then she was still concerned with moral issues, with issues of survivor guilt, with the question about morality in the camps and so on. And she, in a way, the Institute, I think, is also it's testament to her own development as an educational, as a philanthropist, as an entrepreneur that she became. So in a way, the Institute is arguably her way of mastering what she experienced, what she went through. So that's yeah, a remarkable legacy that she left behind.
Can I say something about interviewing? To the question of how to interview a survivor. To me, I think the most important thing is, although it might be interesting for the research, is not to be confrontational and really let the person talk, and whatever the agenda is or whatever the narrative strategy is, to help the person to narrate their life. Because I've certainly seen instances where you have a confrontation and it becomes a sort of struggle between interviewer and interviewee. And as I said, it's interesting, but yeah, that would be my piece of advice, I think, for interviewing, maybe interviewing with anyone in any oral history interview, but especially with survivors.
Great. Thank you all so much. Just leaves it to me to congratulate you once again on the publication of this terrific volume, which I've had the privilege of reading for a workshop tomorrow that they're all hosting, which is great. And I wanted to, of course, thank all of our audience for joining us this evening, and to my co-panelists for talking about the accessibility to testimonies today. And yes, thank you again, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.